It was a quiet Thursday night. My shift at the hospital had dragged on longer than usual, and by the time I was finally driving home, the clock read 2:47 a.m. The parkway stretched out before me, empty and shrouded in darkness. The dense trees on either side seemed to close in, and the fog clinging to the road gave it an eerie, surreal quality. As I drove, a sudden and overwhelming urge hit me, the kind of urge you can't ignore. Nature was calling, and there wasn't a gas station or rest stop for miles. I sighed, scanned the road for a safe spot, and finally pulled over onto the shoulder. It wasn't ideal, but desperation left me no choice. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out into the cold night air. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I hurried, shining the flashlight nervously into the surrounding trees, half expecting to see something, or someone, staring back at me. When I finished and returned to my car, relief quickly turned to dread. I slid into the driver's seat, inserted the key, and turned it. Nothing. The engine sputtered weakly before falling silent. I tried again. Still nothing. My stomach dropped as I realized the battery might be dead. Great, I muttered, glancing around at the desolate road. There wasn't a soul in sight. I decided not to push my luck with the battery further. Instead, I flicked on my hazard lights, stepped out, and stood by the car, waving my arms whenever headlights appeared in the distance. It didn't take long before a vehicle slowed down, a black pickup truck with heavily tinted windows. The truck rolled to a stop a few feet ahead of me, and two men climbed out. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothes. One of them, the taller of the two, had a scruffy beard and piercing eyes that gleamed under the dim light. "You need some help?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Yeah," I said hesitantly. "My car won't start. I think the battery's dead." The other man, stockier and silent, stood a few steps behind him, watching me intently. "We don't have jumper cables," the bearded man said, scratching his chin. "But I can call a buddy who does. He's not far from here." Something about their demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. Maybe it was the way the stocky one was staring at me, unblinking, or how the bearded man's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's okay," I said quickly, pulling out my phone. "I'll call my brother. He's close by and has cables." I dialed Luke's number, relieved when he picked up almost immediately. I explained the situation, and he promised to come as quickly as he could. After ending the call, I turned back to the two men. "Thanks, but my brother's on his way. He should be here in about 10 minutes. The bearded man's smile faltered. "All right," he said slowly. "We'll stick around, just in case." I didn't want to argue, but their lingering presence only heightened my unease. I got back into my car and locked the doors, keeping an eye on them through the rearview mirror. They didn't leave. Instead, they stood by their truck, talking in low voices and occasionally glancing in my direction. 5 minutes passed, and a second vehicle pulled up, a rusted sedan with its headlights barely functioning. My heart sank as two more men stepped out, joining the first pair. "Hey!" the bearded man called out to me. "You sure you don't need that help? My buddy's got cables in his car now." "No, thanks," I shouted back, trying to keep my voice steady. "My brother's almost here." The four of them started walking toward my car. Just as I was contemplating whether I should try running into the woods or staying locked in the car, I saw another set of headlights approaching. This time, it was Luke. Relief washed over me as his truck came to a screeching halt behind my car. He jumped out, holding a baseball bat in one hand and another bat tucked under his arm. "What's going on here?" Luke demanded, his voice booming with authority. The four men stopped in their tracks. "Just trying to help," the bearded man said, raising his hands defensively. "Doesn't look like she needs your kind of help." Luke shot back, tossing me the spare bat. "We're good here. You can leave." The men exchanged glances, their expressions darkening. For a moment I thought they might argue, but they slowly backed away, retreating to their vehicles. Or so I thought. As Luke connected the jumper cables to my car, I noticed something strange. One of the original two men, the stocky one, was no longer in sight. A chill ran down my spine as I scanned the trees and spotted movement. He was crouched just beyond the tree line, creeping toward us. "Luke!" I hissed, pointing toward the man. My brother straightened up immediately, brandishing his bat. "Hey! You better get out of there before I come over!" Luke shouted. The man froze, then slunk back into the shadows. "Try starting it now," Luke said, his eyes never leaving the trees. I turned the key, and to my immense relief, the engine roared to life. Luke hurriedly unhooked the cables and tossed them into his truck. "Here's the plan," he said quickly. "I'll back out first. Stay close behind me, and don't stop for anything." I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he got into his truck. As soon as he started moving, I followed. We had barely gone 10 feet when something slammed into the back of my car. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, and I ducked instinctively. A brick had been hurled through my rear windshield. Then came the gunshots. The first bullet took out what remained of my rear window, and I heard another was passed, dangerously close. Luke swerved, and I followed suit, both of us zigzagging down the road to make ourselves harder targets. My heart pounded as I pressed the accelerator, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and them. Eventually, their vehicles disappeared in my rearview mirror, and the road ahead was empty once more. When we finally pulled into our driveway, I collapsed against the steering wheel, my hands trembling. Luke got out of his truck, his face pale but determined. Inside, we told our dad everything. He listened quietly, his expression growing grimmer by the second. "You were lucky," he said finally. "That stretch of the parkway is notorious. Gangs run that area. They probably wanted to rob you, or worse. Never stop there again, no matter how desperate you are." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. That night, I learned a hard lesson about the dangers lurking in the shadows of the world, and I swore never to take a back road alone after dark again. It started like any other drive, a straight shot through quiet country roads, just me, my trusty old sedan, and an evening playlist humming along in the background. The plan was simple: get back home before the night swallowed the horizon. But as luck would have it, the gas gauge had other plans. I didn't think much of it when the needle crept below. Maybe I was too distracted by the calming monotony of the empty road. When the engine sputtered and died, it hit me. I was stranded, alone, in the middle of nowhere. The only sign of life was a house perched on a hill to my right. It looked old, maybe even abandoned at first glance, but a faint glow from the windows told me otherwise. My phone signal was spotty at best, and calling Emily, my girlfriend, felt like a last resort. She was hours away, and I didn't want to worry her unless it was absolutely necessary. So, I decided to check out the house. Surely someone there could help. I grabbed my jacket and headed toward the house, the gravel crunching under my boots. As I got closer, I noticed the place had seen better days. The paint peeled off in long strips, the porch sagged slightly, and the whole structure seemed to lean just a little too far into the wind. But the lights were on, so I swallowed my unease and climbed the creaking steps. The doorbell echoed unnervingly through the house. I waited. Nothing. I pressed it again, holding it a second longer this time. Still, no one came to the door. I was about to turn back when a faint sound reached me, soft at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from the side of the house, somewhere near a cluster of overgrown bushes. It sounded like crying? No, more like a muffled groan, labored and full of pain. I froze, unsure of what to do. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something about the sound made my stomach twist. Someone could be hurt. Still, I didn't want to trespass. Hesitation won out, and I headed back to the car. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced back at the house. That's when I saw it. A figure, silhouetted against the dim light of an upstairs window, stood perfectly still. They were watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, motionless, staring down at me. I turned the key in the ignition out of reflex, even though I knew the car wouldn't start. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. By some miracle, I managed to get through to AAA. They promised someone would arrive within 30 minutes. 30 minutes felt like an eternity, but at least I had a plan. As I sat there, trying to shake the image of that figure from my mind, a voice startled me. "Excuse me." It was deep and hoarse, like gravel grinding underfoot. I turned sharply to see a man standing by the side of the road, just outside the beam of my headlights. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face, and his posture was hunched, almost as if he were apologizing for his presence. "Car trouble?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, my voice unsteady. "Ran out of gas." He nodded slowly, as though he'd expected that answer. "Oh," he muttered, then turned and walked back toward the house without another word. He disappeared into the same bushes where I'd heard the groaning earlier. Every nerve in my body told me to leave. But where would I go? My car was dead, and I was miles from the nearest town. I pulled out my phone and texted Emily, giving her a brief rundown of the situation. She replied almost immediately. "Go back to the house. Check out the noise. Someone could need help." Her words felt like a challenge. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but the thought of returning to that house made my skin crawl. Still, I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone was in danger. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and set off, this time skirting the road to avoid being seen. The bushes were thicker than I'd realized, their branches clawing at my clothes as I pushed through. The groaning had stopped, but a faint wheezing sound guided me closer. It led me to a side window, partially obscured by curtains. "Hello?" I whispered, tapping lightly on the glass. "Is someone in there?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing, came a reply. "Help me." The voice was weak, almost childlike. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear to the window. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Before I could get an answer, the curtain shifted slightly, revealing a face, a man's face. His features were gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. It was the same man who had spoken to me on the road, I was sure of it. His eyes locked onto mine for a split second before the curtain snapped shut. The window slammed closed with such force that I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. Branches whipped against my face as I tore through the bushes and back to the car. My hands fumbled with the lock, and I practically threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house. The upstairs window was dark now, the figure gone. The entire house seemed to shrink into itself, as if it had swallowed its secrets whole. When the AAA driver finally arrived, I didn't say a word about what I'd seen. I just let him fill the tank and thanked him with a trembling smile. As soon as the engine roared to life, I hit the gas and didn't look back. It started like any other Saturday night. My friends, my boyfriend, and I had decided to hit one of the downtown clubs. The kind of place where the bass vibrates in your chest, and the air is thick with perfume, sweat, and the faint whiff of tequila. The night had been going fine until, well, it wasn't. It started with a stupid argument. I don't even remember what it was about now. Something trivial, like him ignoring me while he chatted with some girl he claimed to know from work. I was irritated, and the mix of alcohol and loud music didn't help. So I stormed out. Stubborn and dramatic, I decided I'd find my own way home. The night air hit me like a slap when I stepped outside, the cool breeze a stark contrast to the stifling heat inside. The streets were buzzing, laughing couples, a few rowdy groups stumbling between bars, and the occasional lone figure hailing a cab. I pulled out my phone and called for an Uber. A Nissan Altima, black, driven by someone named Jordan, would be there in 5 minutes. Perfect. I waited under the club's awning, hugging myself for warmth as I scrolled through my phone to pass the time. It was one of those moments where you feel both annoyed and a little smug. I'd left on my terms, hadn't I? But then something strange happened. A white car, definitely not a black Nissan, pulled up to the curb. The driver rolled down the window, and I saw a woman. She looked to be in her late 30s, wearing a hoodie and glasses. Her face was plain, almost forgettable. "Are you waiting for an Uber?" she asked. Her voice was calm, friendly even. I hesitated. Yeah? Are you for Sophie?" She nodded. "Yep, that's me." Without thinking too hard about it, I opened the door and got in. In hindsight, I kicked myself for that moment. The car wasn't even the right color, and I'd barely glanced at her license plate. But it was late, I was annoyed, and she looked safe. A woman, after all. I buckled up, still scrolling on my phone, until I realized something felt off. The interior of the car was spotless, almost unnaturally so. No personal items, no air freshener, no signs of wear and tear. Just a plain, sterile space. But what really struck me was how she drove, rigid, mechanical. Her hands clutched the wheel tightly, and her eyes never left the road. Trying to break the tension, I made small talk. "Busy night for Uber drivers?" She didn't answer. "Is this your full-time gig, or do you do something else?" I tried again. Nothing. She didn't even glance at me. The unease started creeping in like a cold draft. I checked my phone. The route on the app wasn't matching where we were going. We were supposed to head west toward my apartment, but she was driving east. "Hey, I think you're going the wrong way," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She finally spoke, her tone flat and devoid of emotion. "Taking the highway. It's faster." I knew that wasn't true. I'd taken Ubers from downtown countless times, and the highway wasn't the fastest route. My stomach tightened. Something was wrong. I opened the app again to double-check, and that's when I saw the notification, "Your driver has arrived. Jordan is waiting for you in a black Nissan." My blood ran cold. The car I was in was white. The driver's name wasn't Jordan. And worst of all, my real Uber had just pulled up outside the club I'd left behind. Panic surged through me. "This isn't my Uber," I said, my voice trembling. "You need to let me out." She didn't respond. Her hands tightened on the wheel, her knuckles white. I reached for the door handle, but it didn't budge. Child locks. Of course. "Stop the car!" I shouted, my voice rising in hysteria. "I said stop the car right now!" Still, she didn't answer. The car sped up, the streetlights outside blurring as they passed. I realized I didn't even know where we were heading, some deserted industrial area or an empty highway. My mind raced with horrible possibilities. Desperate, I started pounding on the window, screaming for help, hoping someone, anyone, would hear me. But the streets had thinned out, and there was no one around. The car's sterile silence seemed to swallow my cries. Then, something shifted. Maybe it was the commotion I was making, or maybe she just decided I wasn't worth the trouble. The car slowed, pulling over to the side of a quiet, dimly lit road. My heart pounded in my chest as she unlocked the doors. "Get out," she said, her voice as cold as ever. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the door open and stumbled out, nearly falling onto the pavement. The car sped off before I could even catch my breath, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Shaking, I fumbled with my phone and called Jordan, my actual Uber driver. He was still waiting near the club, confused about why I hadn't shown up. When he finally picked me up, I blurted out everything that had just happened. His face darkened as I spoke. "You're lucky," he said grimly. "This kind of thing happens more than you'd think. People pretending to be rideshare drivers, targeting women leaving bars or clubs. It's usually human trafficking. You got out just in time." I felt sick. The reality of what could have happened hit me like a tidal wave. I'd been seconds away from who knows what. Since that night, I've been hypervigilant about using rideshare services. I double-check the car make, model, and license plate every single time. I verify the driver's name before I even touch the door handle. Looking back, I know how easily it could have ended differently. It's not just a scare story, it happened to me. And if you think it can happen to you, think again. Always check your ride. It was a chilly October night, and I was driving back to my apartment after spending the evening at a friend's place in the countryside. The highway stretched endlessly before me, its asphalt glistening faintly under the weak glow of my headlights. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees lining the road. I had taken this route a few times before, but tonight it felt different, eerier. Maybe it was the moonless sky, or maybe it was the fact that my phone had lost signal an hour ago, leaving me completely disconnected from the world. I remember thinking to myself how stories always start this way: a lonely road, an empty phone, and an uneasy feeling you can't quite shake. The clock on my dashboard read 11:43 p.m. when I first saw it. 2 cars, seemingly abandoned, blocking both lanes ahead. Their headlights were off, but their hazard lights flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows on the surrounding trees. My first thought was that there had been an accident. But as I slowed down and approached, something struck me as odd. There was no visible damage on either car. Not even a scratch or a dent. They were just parked there, angled slightly as if they'd come to a sudden stop. I rolled my window down a crack, expecting to hear voices, maybe someone calling for help. But there was only silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I hesitated for a moment, my foot hovering over the brake. Then I told myself I was being ridiculous. Someone could be hurt and need assistance. So, reluctantly, I pulled over to the shoulder, leaving my engine running. Grabbing my flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out into the cold night air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I approached the cars. The first one was an old sedan, its interior shrouded in darkness. I peered inside but saw nothing, no movement, no signs of life. The second car, an SUV, was parked just a few feet away. Its rear door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. That's when I saw them. 2 figures crouched low behind the SUV, barely visible in the dim light. At first, I thought they might be injured passengers, but something about their posture seemed wrong. They weren't moving, just crouching there, their heads tilted slightly as if listening. My flashlight's beam caught the faintest glint of eyes, reflecting the light back at me. My stomach twisted into a knot. I froze, my mind racing. Should I call out to them? Ask if they needed help? But a nagging instinct screamed at me to stay silent. Pretend I hadn't seen them. So I did just that. I turned my flashlight away and began walking back to my car, trying to keep my steps calm and measured despite the surge of adrenaline pounding in my veins. The moment I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, I felt a rush of relief. But it was short-lived. As I shifted into reverse, glancing over my shoulder, I caught sight of them through the rearview mirror. They were standing now, no longer hiding, their faces obscured in shadow. They weren't running toward me, but they didn't need to. The mere sight of them, motionless and staring, sent a chill down my spine. My breath quickened as I backed up, maneuvering around their cars. I didn't care if I scratched my own paint or hit a ditch. I just needed to get out of there. As I put some distance between us, I risked one last glance in the mirror. They were still standing there, watching me. I floored it. The road blurred under my tires as I sped away, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. My mind reeled with questions. Who were they? Why were they hiding? Was this some kind of trap? A staged accident to lure in unsuspecting drivers? My gut told me it was more than that, something far worse than I could comprehend. It wasn't until I was miles away, the 2 cars and their ominous occupants long out of sight, that I finally slowed down. My heart was still racing, but I felt a flicker of safety. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping, not even for the gas I desperately needed. When I got back to my apartment, I locked every door and window and sat in the dark for hours, replaying the events of the night in my head. I thought about calling the police, but what could I say? I saw two people standing behind a car, and it freaked me out. They'd think I was paranoid, maybe even drunk. For weeks afterward, I avoided that road. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched online for news of any accidents or crimes reported in that area. Nothing came up. No missing persons, no abandoned cars. It was as if the entire incident had never happened. It happened last fall, during one of my solo camping trips. I've always loved the wilderness. There's something profoundly peaceful about being alone under a star-filled sky, surrounded by nothing but nature. But after that night, I learned the woods can also be terrifying. I had driven out to a spot near the Appalachian Trail in Virginia, a secluded area by a narrow, winding river. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the amber and crimson leaves of early autumn. I parked my old Jeep on a dirt trail not far from where I planned to camp and carried my gear about half a mile downriver to a clearing. It was perfect, flat ground for my tent, a fire pit someone had left behind, and the soft murmur of the river to keep me company. As night fell, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. The air was crisp but not too cold. I sat there for a while, sipping coffee from my thermos and listening to the symphony of crickets and the occasional splash from the river. It was idyllic. Around 10 p.m., I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself into my sleeping bag, ready for a good night's sleep. That's when I heard it. At first, it was distant, just the faint sound of twigs snapping somewhere in the woods. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other harmless animal. But as the minutes passed, the sounds grew closer, more deliberate. Twigs gave way to the crunch of leaves, and soon, I could hear faint but distinct footsteps circling the tent. I froze. My heart started racing, but I stayed perfectly still, listening. It's nothing, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon, or even a curious bear. But the steps were too light, too measured for an animal. They stopped. Silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I strained my ears, hoping I'd imagined it. And then, just outside the thin fabric of my tent, I heard it, a soft, deliberate shuffle. Someone, or something, was standing right there. I reached for my flashlight and knife, both tucked into the side of my sleeping bag. My hand trembled as I clicked the flashlight on, aiming it at the tent wall. The beam of light illuminated nothing but the nylon fabric, but it made the presence outside stir. There was a rustling sound, followed by hurried footsteps retreating into the darkness. My heart was pounding. I unzipped the tent slowly and poked my head out, flashlight in one hand and knife in the other. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, but I couldn't see anything. Then, just as I was about to retreat back into my tent, I saw it, a faint glow in the woods, like the screen of a cell phone. It blinked once, then disappeared. Someone was out there, watching me. I panicked. I grabbed my gun from my pack, I always bring one on these trips, and started breaking camp as quickly and quietly as possible. My hands shook as I rolled up my sleeping bag and disassembled the tent. The footsteps returned, circling again, always just out of sight. I didn't dare call out or shine my flashlight for fear of provoking whoever, or whatever, was out there. Finally, I had everything packed. Slinging my gear over my shoulder, I bolted for the Jeep, flashlight darting ahead of me to light the narrow trail. Every step felt like an eternity. The crunch of leaves behind me grew louder, faster, and my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Was it one person? More? Were they armed? When I reached the Jeep, I threw my gear in the back and jumped into the driver's seat. My hands fumbled with the keys, but when I finally got the engine running, I didn't move. Something felt off. I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed my reflection was distorted, the glass shimmering unnaturally. No. Not the mirror, the tires. I got out and walked around the Jeep, and my stomach dropped. All 4 tires had been slashed. Deep, jagged cuts rendered them completely useless. I was stranded. Panic set in. I locked myself inside the Jeep, clutching the gun in one hand and my phone in the other. I tried calling 911, but the signal was weak. The call wouldn't connect. My hands shook as I sent a text to a friend with my location, praying it would go through. Then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, illuminated by the dim glow of the interior light, stood a figure. A man, tall and motionless, dressed in dark clothing, was standing about 10 feet behind the Jeep. He was staring straight at me. I rolled down the window just enough to yell, "Who are you? What do you want?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hands slowly, as if surrendering. Then, without a word, he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the Jeep, doors locked, gun in my lap. Every sound outside made me jump. I thought about trying to hike back to the main road but decided it was too risky in the dark. So I waited, counting the hours until dawn. When morning finally came, I felt a cautious sense of relief. I stepped out of the Jeep, scanning the area for any sign of the man. He was gone, but I found his footprints in the soft dirt around the vehicle. They circled the Jeep several times, as if he'd been pacing all night. I called the police as soon as I got a signal. A state trooper arrived about an hour later. He didn't seem surprised when I told him what happened. "We've had reports of strange activity in these woods," he said, his tone grim. "Could be someone living out here, or just drifters passing through. Either way, you're lucky you weren't hurt." A tow truck came to haul the Jeep back to town, where I got the tires replaced. The mechanic found a crude, homemade knife blade lodged in one of the punctures. "Looks like someone wanted to scare the hell out of you," he said, shaking his head. I've thought about that night a lot since then. I still go camping. I refuse to let fear take away something I love, but I'm more cautious now. I always camp closer to other people, carry a satellite phone, and sleep with one eye open. The woods are beautiful, yes. But they're also vast and unforgiving, and sometimes, you're not as alone as you think.